Massive bombings were reported throughout the entire Gaza Strip following repeated incidents of Hamas operatives opening fire at IDF soldiers. These escalations came at the same time as the UN Security Council approved the proposal of the United States. This is a proposal for an international transitional authority that will be led by Trump in the Gaza Strip. We're going to talk about what this resolution says and what do we expect to happen next. We're also going to talk about the ongoing escalations in the West Bank and a leaked message from an Israeli settler group exposing how many attacks have been carried out against Palestinians. You're watching the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. Hit that subscribe button. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. In this summary of the past week, I'm going to talk about three main things. First, the continued rounds of violence between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which I will say have escalated quite dramatically over the past week. Next, I'm going to discuss and unpack the UN Security Council resolution on the situation in Gaza that was passed during this past week, and explore what does that resolution say about the next phases of the ceasefire, what are some of the glaring loopholes that still exist in that resolution, and what do we expect to happen next. Third, I'm going to briefly talk about the escalations that are going on in the West Bank, attacks by settlers against Palestinians, attacks from Palestinians against Israeli settlers, and attacks from both sides against the Israeli military and the raids of the Israeli military. Before I continue, I'm also going to announce that I have set a personal goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers before the end of 2025. So, if you find these reports informative, please remember, hit that subscribe button and help me reach that goal. So, starting with the Gaza Strip. Just a reminder of where do things stand in the Gaza Strip. Right now, the situation between the sides between Israel and Hamas can only be described as a complete stalemate. Phase 1 of the ceasefire between the sides included, among others, the Israeli military redeploying to what has become known as the Yellow Line in the Gaza Strip, a truce between the sides, entrance of humanitarian aid, the opening of the Rafah crossing, and the return of all living and dead hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. While all living hostages were released and the majority of hostages' bodies have been gradually returned by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, at present time there are still 3 bodies of hostages that have not been returned, and a lot of questions have been raised over the last week as to if Hamas even knows the location of the bodies of those hostages. That situation, however, has resulted in a complete stalemate between the sides, since Phase 1 says that all those things have to be completed in order to move on to Phase 2. At this point, the Israeli military has redeployed and controls roughly 53% of the Gaza Strip, and Hamas has de facto taken over the power vacuum in the rest of the Gaza Strip, the other 47%, rebuilding its militant apparatus and reestablishing its governing bodies in those areas. At the same time, the humanitarian aid is entering into the Gaza Strip, but the Rafah crossing remains closed. Within this situation, over the past week, there was an eruption of violence that resulted in airstrikes and gun battles almost every day throughout the Gaza Strip. The majority of these incidents were cases where Palestinians crossed over the Yellow Line into the territory of the Israeli military and were then attacked by airstrikes or by Israeli troops on the ground. Just for some examples, incidents like these were reported in the areas of Sajaiya and Zaytun in northern Gaza on Sunday, Monday, and on Wednesday, and similar incidents of Palestinians crossing the Yellow Line and then being attacked by the Israeli military were reported in the southern regions of Han Yunis on Monday, Thursday, and Friday. In all of those incidents, the Israeli military stated that Palestinians were armed and endangering Israeli soldiers in violation of the truce, that armed Palestinians were crossing over the Yellow Line and endangering Israeli soldiers, and that's why they were attacked, while Palestinian sources reported in all of those incidents that the Palestinians were unarmed, posed no threat, and held Israel responsible for the violations of the truce. The 2 major escalations, however, happened on Wednesday and on Saturday. In both of those incidents, Palestinian operatives had managed to approach IDF troops in Han Yunis and open fire on IDF soldiers beyond the Yellow Line. No Israeli soldiers were killed or injured in both those incidents. Israel released this footage of one of the attacks, while Hamas issued statements denying any involvement in those incidents. In response, on both days, Israel carried out major rounds of bombings throughout the different parts of the Gaza Strip. On Wednesday, massive airstrikes were reported in the areas of Zaytun, in the areas of northern Gaza over here. And there were also airstrikes reported in Sajaiya and in Palestine Square, all in the center of Gaza City. In the southern parts of Gaza, attacks were reported on that day in Han Yunis as well, and there were also Palestinian reports of Navy bombings in the Al-Muasi regions of Han Yunis, that is in the southern parts over here. On Saturday, bombings included an attack on a vehicle in the Rimal region of the western parts of Gaza City, again in the northern parts of Gaza, as well as substantial bombings are also reported in the Al-Balah and the Al-Nuseirat refugee camp in the central parts of the Gaza Strip. The targets of all those bombings, according to the Israeli military, were a series of Al-Qassam and Hamas figures. Among others, on Wednesday, Abdullah Abu Shamala, who was Hamas's naval commander, and Fadi Abu Mustafa, who was a person in charge of Hamas's tunnel divisions in Han Yunis, were reportedly assassinated. And on Saturday, Hamas announced that Ala al-Hadidi, who is one of the top commanders of Hamas in charge of logistical armaments and supplies, was assassinated in that attack in Rimal. The Israeli military reported that alongside these, 2 more platoon commanders of Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades were assassinated in those various attacks. Palestinian sources reported that throughout Wednesday and Saturday, a total of 52 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip and over 100 were injured. Throughout the day on Saturday, there were several reports that Hamas announced that it now considers a ceasefire between the sides to be over due to the Israeli attacks. However, shortly before I recorded this, 2 Hamas leaders, Khalil al-Haya and Musa Abu Marzouk, were quoted in different outlets stating that the movement remains committed to the ceasefire, but demands that Israel be held accountable for these escalations. With that, I'm also going to say that Saturday's escalation is still ongoing while I'm recording this, so the numbers of how many people have been killed and injured may still vary. This past week, however, has included the highest amount of these violent incidents, bombings, and escalations and attacks of Palestinians as well. It is not the deadliest week that has been in the Gaza Strip since the declaration of the ceasefire, but it is an indication of how fragile the situation remains. This stalemate at this point may continue until the sides agree to move on to phase 2, and during that stalemate, there are likely to be these continued incidents of Palestinians crossing over the yellow line, as well as continued incidents of armed Palestinians carrying out attacks. And in all those cases, the Israeli military is likely to continue to carry out its bombings in the Gaza Strip. So the situation right now continues to be very volatile as we are stuck in this current stalemate. Turning to the international arena, the major development of this past week was the United States promoting and passing UN Security Council Resolution 2803, formalizing the next phases of the ceasefire and the end to the war in the Gaza Strip. Now, in my previous videos, I already analyzed the different points of the draft resolution that the United States was putting forward and what does it mean. So rather than going article by article, here I'm going to give a broad overview of how the resolution envisions the next phases of the ceasefire, as well as discuss some of the last-minute changes that were made, as well as some of the questions that still remain very open even after that resolution was passed. The first main aspect of the resolution is the official recognition of a future international board of peace that is going to be run by US President Trump and will serve as a transitory administration for the Gaza Strip, with the aim being to coordinate the funding and organize the redevelopment of the entire Gaza Strip. I remind everyone that in Trump's 20-point plan, the Board of Peace was mentioned. It said that it will be run by Trump and possibly also by Tony Blair. And since then, there's been a lot of different statements that it is going to include the heads of state of a lot of different countries that want to participate in the rebuilding of Gaza. The big change, however, that was added to the final resolution that was accepted, that is different from the draft that was circulated last week, relates to what happens in the future after Gaza is rebuilt. In the original draft, it said that the Board of Peace will administer Gaza until the Palestinian Authority has undergone reforms that are satisfactory to the Board of Peace and to Israel, and it didn't say what happens next. In the final accepted resolution, however, Israel's veto on this matter was removed. Israel's not mentioned at all in that article. And instead, it explicitly states that the Palestinian Authority will undergo reforms based on Trump's 2020 plan and the more recent Saudi-French plan, and that after that, quote, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, end quote. So, in a moment of analysis, it's important to note that this addition is very significant. Not only does it explicitly say that the aim of rebuilding Gaza is to have a future pathway towards a Palestinian state, but also, I'll say possibly even more importantly, this statement implicitly links the reforms of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank to a future state in the Gaza Strip. This is one of the first times in the different proposals for ending the war that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are being linked together rather than everyone focusing only on the rebuilding of Gaza, the future of Gaza, and international administration in Gaza, if Israel will have any control over Gaza. This is one of the first times, and this is now accepted by the UN Security Council, that the two territories are linked, and what happens in the reforms of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank now is supposed to pertain to a future state that relates both to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The second critical facet of the resolution relates to the establishment of the International Stabilization Force, what has become known as the ISF. This international force is in essence meant to be the military wing of the Board of Peace and will be established by the Board of Peace and be made up of troops from a variety of different international countries. The final draft did not change the aims of the ISF, which are, among others, to help train and deploy Palestinian police, secure borders, ensure the process of demilitarization in Gaza, including the destruction of military weaponry, and protect civilians and humanitarian missions in the Gaza Strip. What was added in the final approved resolution, however, was a linking of the ISF's activity to the withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip, saying explicitly that the two processes are linked and that Israel will withdraw from the Strip to a border buffer zone between Gaza and Egypt, and this will happen in parallel to the ISF carrying out its missions. Beyond this, the resolution also discusses humanitarian aid, funding from the World Bank, and other technical facets of the International Board of Peace and the future of Gaza's administration. So, with the passing of this resolution, what can we expect to happen next in Gaza? On the one hand, the adoption of this resolution is a major step forward in the implementation of the next phases of the ceasefire plan. Among others, the recognition of the UN Security Council specifically legitimizes these moves of a Board of Peace and the ISF by international law, and the World Bank has already announced its intent to cooperate and help fund this endeavor. On the other hand, the resolution still leaves some glaring questions open that are likely to be the subject of very complex negotiations and will probably complicate things when it comes to the actual implementation. Two facets are possibly the most glaring of these questions. First, the role of the ISF. It still remains very unclear what exactly is going to be its mission in terms of implementation and what's going to be its mandate. Among others, it states that the ISF is going to ensure the demilitarization of Gaza and decommissioning of weaponry, but it does not say if the body will be authorized to do this by force or if it just does this with the cooperation of the different Palestinian organizations. In other words, the resolution works if all sides are cooperating, but if Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad refuse to disarm, it's not clear what happens at that stage. Is the ISF supposed to do this by force, or are the sides supposed to negotiate? On the flip side, the resolution also says that the ISF is going to protect humanitarian missions and the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. And this is also equally unclear. What happens if there is an escalation, for example, between Hamas and Israel? Is the ISF then supposed to act to protect Palestinian civilians against the Israeli military attacks? Will it have such a mandate? Is this going to be done by force? Again, all those things remain unclear. And the last thing also that pertains to the ISF, it's unclear who is allowed to participate. Can any country offer to send troops? Does Israel have a veto power? Does the United States have a veto power? At this point, we don't know. So again, the ISF, a lot of questions surrounding what's going to be its mandate and how it's actually supposed to carry out its mission. A second facet that also has a lot of question marks hovering over it relates to that future Palestinian state that is mentioned. While this addition caused massive uproar in Israel, and like I said, it is quite significant when we look at it, the wording is in fact still very vague. It says if reforms are carried out, then the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood. This is far from a guarantee of a future Palestinian state and leaves each side to interpret it very differently. Israel is likely interpreting that as many variables and escape clauses that are going to stop the creation of a Palestinian state, while Palestinian Authority and Palestinians more broadly are likely looking at that as a guarantee for the implementation of the plan and a future Palestinian state if those reforms are in fact carried out. So very likely this is going to lead to future disagreements with regards to what was supposed to happen here. With these glaring questions, there were expectedly very different reactions from Israel and the different Palestinian factions after the passing of that resolution. Immediately after the resolution was accepted, Hamas announced that it rejects the decision entirely and that it sees the Board of Peace as another international occupation administration that will use the ISF to carry out Israel's bidding, forcibly disarming Hamas and what it calls the resistance movements. Hazem Qasim, one of Hamas's spokespeople, explicitly stated on Wednesday that the addition of discussing a Palestinian state was purely cosmetic and has no real application when it comes to the deploying of the ISF or the Board of Peace. Similar statements were also made by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Joint Command of Palestinian Factions in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority, in turn, welcomed the resolution, emphasizing that there is a need for its full implementation in order to protect Palestinians and ensure an IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority also said that it is ready to work with the United States and international bodies to assume full responsibility for Gaza and a future Palestinian state, but it did not mention the clauses that relate to the demilitarization or disarming of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or to reforms in the Palestinian Authority. Israel, in turn, also issued a statement welcoming the resolution, praising Trump for his leadership and bringing about the agreement. In its statement, Israel emphasized that the resolution will bring about the return of the hostages' bodies, the disarming and demilitarizing of Gaza, and added also the de-radicalization of the Gaza Strip. Israel's statement, however, did not mention the Israeli military withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, nor did it mention the end to the war, or the Palestinian Authority, or a future Palestinian state. So, once again, what we have is the passing of the resolution. This is a monumental step forward with regards to the international community being committed to implementing the next phase of the ceasefire. However, at this point, it is not clear how that actually takes place on the ground and what's going to be the mandate of the ISF. There were some suggestions in a recent article in the Washington Post about how the United States wants to possibly view the next step that's going to happen on the ground, and among others, it suggested the United States may want to start rebuilding parts of the Gaza Strip without disarming Hamas and leaving Hamas to possibly disintegrate even more in the future. I'm not going to develop this right now. I will try to upload a special report on that in the coming days. Keep an eye out for that in the channel. Before I conclude, I'm going to add a brief note about the ongoing escalations in the West Bank. While over the past 2 years, there have been increasing incidents of violence between Palestinians, Israeli settlers, and the Israeli military, over the past week, and more broadly, since the beginning of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, there was a dramatic increase in the raids and attacks that were carried out by Israeli settlers targeting Palestinians, as well as turning their violence towards the Israeli military as well. During this past week, the escalations began on Monday when the Israeli military evacuated an outpost settlement that had been established without Israeli authority in the West Bank. During that evacuation, Israeli settlers attacked IDF soldiers and Israeli police officers, resulting in 2 injuries and 4 settlers being arrested. Hours later, reports began to emerge of raids of Israeli settlers that were being carried out in several locations in the West Bank, including torching Palestinian cars and homes being vandalized in the areas of Wadi Seir, this is in the southern areas of Hebron, as well as a major raid that was carried out in the areas of Jebba near Bethlehem, which resulted in several Palestinian homes and cars being torched and 2 Palestinians injured. In the following day, there was a Palestinian attack that took place in the Gush Etzion area. The attack involved a car ramming targeting Israeli settlers in the area, with the Palestinian attackers then emerging with a knife and continuing to a stabbing attack. 1 Israeli was killed in that attack and 3 were injured. The 2 Palestinian attackers were shot and killed. The following day, on Wednesday, a raid of Israeli settlers took place in the Ramon village near Ramallah. And on Thursday, there were 2 more settler attacks that were reported, one targeting a Palestinian family in Maspariyata that resulted in 3 family members being badly injured, and one which was a major raid that took place in the Hawara region. According to reports and video images, dozens of masked Israeli settlers raided the Hawara village, torching a substantial amount of property and setting fire to a lot of different homes and cars. In all of these various incidents, 4 Israeli settlers were arrested for attacking Israeli military and police force, and 1 Israeli miner was reportedly indicted for attacks against Palestinians. The Israeli military in turn reported arresting over 60 Palestinians in different military operations over the past week in the West Bank. So all of these are rounds of attacks that happened during the past week, and this is not an exhaustive list, just meant to illustrate the extent to which violence is spiraling in the West Bank. In addition to these attacks, however, on Friday there was another thing that happened, which was a leak of an internal message from within a radical Israeli settler group discussing how many attacks were carried out against Palestinians over the past month. According to this internal message, 98 raids were carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians over the past month in the West Bank. The message also lists each and every site that was attacked and how many times it was attacked. The message also cataloged 21 Palestinians that had been injured during those attacks, 48 vehicles that were torched, 19 homes of Palestinians that were burned down, and also the torching of 2 mosques. Again, all that is happening in the past month, and all that is happening within the shadow of the ceasefire in Gaza. We are seeing these substantial escalations. Before I conclude, I'm going to remind everyone about my goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. So, if you watched this far, please do remember, hit that subscribe button and help me reach that goal. I'm also going to remind everyone that if you want to sign up to my newsletter, you can click the link in the first comment below. I'm going to use that in order to update people on things like live streams and lectures that I do and any other news that comes out within this arena. That concludes my latest update in the Israel-Palestine Report. If you find these informative, please do remember, send them on to anyone who you think might be interested. Hit that subscribe button. Let me know if you have any questions or comments in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science and Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.